An air-conditioned campus, very different experience. So it's nice to be outside with all of you today, looking at the architecture and some of the artwork surrounding Cranbrook Institute of Science. And Cranbrook Institute of Science is right behind me. It is Cranbrook's most visited institution by a long shot with... Hello, I lost you there for a minute. I thought this might be a problem here in the middle of our campus with no cell phone towers, so maybe if I stand closer to the building, we can get a better connection. So as I was saying, the Institute of Science is Cranbrook's most visited component, and it's also Cranbrook's most shared component. So Cranbrook Institute of Science reaches many tens of thousands of school children every year, including students at their schools. So we have Science on the Go and Water on the Go that goes out and reaches students in Flint, Pontiac, and Detroit. And then in a normal time of year, we have endless school buses parading down Institute Way in order to come and tour the many galleries and exhibits that are in the building behind me. And today's tour will not be going inside the Institute. We're just going to talk about the architecture on the exterior of the Institute of Science. And all of Cranbrook's fountains are currently not filled, which really detracts from the beauty of the front of the Institute of Science. And so please excuse that. We also have limited ground control, and so things are starting to look a little bit scraggly, including my hair. I have not gotten a haircut. I'm simply trying to style it in a way that keeps it out of my face for these few hours a week that other humans see me virtually. So the Institute of Science has a pretty interesting history. When you look at the charter of the Cranbrook Foundation from 1927, it lists schools, it lists the Art Academy, it even lists schools of horticulture, of arts and crafts. One thing it doesn't mention, the word science does not appear in the Cranbrook Foundation Charter of 27 at all. The word scientific appears once at the suggestion that perhaps in 20 years' time, if the growth of the Cranbrook Foundation continues in such a direction that a scientific arm would be useful, perhaps we would have a new endeavor. It did not take 20 years for the Institute of Science to come into being. In fact, it was only about 2 years from the formation of the Cranbrook Foundation and the opening of Cranbrook School for Boys in 1927 before the Institute of Science began its activities. It opened officially on the 13th of May, 1930. The building that's behind me, the Eliel Saarinen building, doesn't open until May of 1938. And so it has a few different and interesting origin stories that I want to share with you before we get started looking at the details behind me, especially since these stories did not take place here on Sunset Hill. The most famous story that you've probably heard if you've taken one of my tours or if you've visited Cranbrook before is that George Booth and Ellen Booth, he called the speech that he gave when he dedicated the 38 building, George Booth titled it, "The Importance of Little Things." And he was talking both about the little gems and little minerals that were on display and the little bugs and small animals, all the way up to dinosaurs that you might study. But in particular, there was one little thing that happened to George and Ellen Booth that led directly to the Institute of Science. And they were traveling out west in the summer of 1926, escaping the heat that is just now getting here this year, when they stayed in Denver at the Brown Palace Hotel. And they were going to take a pre-dinner evening stroll out in the, town of Denver. And they stepped out of the hotel, and Mr. Booth says, he asked Ellen, "Do we want to go left or do we want to go right?" they went right and they stumbled across a little store called Pondorf's. And Pondorf's was a gem and mineral store. And they were so enchanted with the gems that they saw in the window. They went inside, they examined them under clear light, and George and Ellen Booth bought 277 gems and mineral specimens from Pondorf's. They continued on to San Francisco. When they got back here to Bloomfield Hills, Mr. Booth put the gems and minerals in his house, Cranbrook House, and then he moved them over to Cranbrook School for Boys for the young students to study these gems and minerals. And actually, those of you who know Cranbrook well, you might know in the lower level of Cranbrook School for Boys, in what we call the lower level dining room, there's a colonnade of archways. And Eliel Saarinen actually designed cases to go in between those arches for the gems and minerals from Pondorf's. But George Booth continued to think, and he thought, you know, instead of having all my science collection at the school, why don't I build a separate building for it, and we could invite the public? Around the same time, he started growing, or purchased another collection, the Rollin collection, which was a series of rocks. And I don't want to get too far away from the building because I don't want to lose you. But he buys a $5,000 worth of a rock collection from a collector who was almost 90 years old. You can see some more of the... I'm not actually sure if these are from the Rollin collection, but these were the types of rocks he buys second in 1930. And Mr. Rollin was 89, which was the same age as George's father, Henry Wood Booth. And so they had this connection, the elder geologist and the young Mr. Booth, who really knew nothing about science. He was never as passionate about science as he was art. And so Booth has these gems and minerals, he has these rocks. He also had taxidermed animals, and he hires the first head of this new scientific enterprise, Mr. Bryant Tyrrell, who starts a zoo. And there was a little zoo here at Cranbrook, actually very close to this site on Sunset Hill. The zoo only lasted from 29 to 31 when Mr. Booth's secretary found an exotic black snake in her office one morning, and Mr. Booth shut the zoo down. It was also being run by our facilities person, so it wasn't exactly a sort of state-of-the-art zoological project. But what was state-of-the-art was Mr. Booth's interest in astronomy. He had bought a telescope in Paris in the 19-teens, and he kept that at Cranbrook House, and he would use it to entertain visitors to Cranbrook House. At Cranbrook School for Boys, Eliel Saarinen on the top of the tower designed an observatory, and he put a telescope in the top of the school, which made Cranbrook School for Boys only the second prep school in the country to have an observatory and the first prep school to have an instructor in astronomy. However, if you know the School for Boys, the telescope was on top of the tower, which was next to the chimneys, and the smoke coming out of the chimneys would obscure the view to the heavens. And so in 1930, just a year after the telescope was installed on the other side of campus, Mr. Booth designs and builds the first purpose-built building for the Cranbrook Institute of Science. And so I'll turn the camera around. Now, when this was built, it was a cinder block and wood shingle building with the telescope up at the top. Now, there's been a dozen different telescopes that have been used here in the observatory, but the octagonal-shaped building is original to George Booth's design from 1930. And it was connected to a large square wooden building that went in a courtyard, of which this is the only part of the 1930 Institute of Science that survives. And Eliel Saarinen actually reclad it in brick in 1938. Now, the rest of the Science Institute building was a sort of square cinder block building that ran around this edge. And it very quickly was becoming outgrown. It was a place where there would be research. There would also be laboratories for experiments, but there wasn't much exhibition space. And so the early days, it really was a research institute. But as it became a larger public entity, George Booth had to think about where he wanted to take the Institute of Science. And so he suggested moving it to Cranbrook House, which would have been wild. He and Ellen would have moved into a new home, and the Institute would have taken over his main house. However, when he learned that they already had 20,000 visitors a year visiting the observatory here, he thought, I can't have 20,000 people in Cranbrook House. So Eliel Saarinen designed a different museum to go on Lone Pine Road, right where the Greek Theater is. Eventually, though, George Booth says, nope, I want to keep my little observatory here. Saarinen, you design an addition. And so Saarinen's design was completed in 1936. Construction started in April of 36. And when you're looking at this, I want you to do like I do, and all good lovers of beautiful things do, and you have to eliminate this wing here. This was put on in the late 1950s, much against the wishes of Loya and Eero Saarinen. Eero Saarinen fought very strongly to not have this room put on. And Eero Saarinen had been involved in the design of the first Institute of Science. So Eliel is credited as the architect, but his son Eero had just come back from studying architecture at Yale, and then he studied architecture in Finland. He had traveled around all through Europe looking at buildings, and he returned to practice with his father in 1936 at the same time this building was being designed. As we look at the design, originally this was just a blank brick wall because all of the exhibits were on this first floor. And so there were exhibits about Earth and natural history along the first floor. On the second floor, there were offices as well as the Institute of Science library. And just to give you a sense of how much more interested George Booth was, I think, in art than science. When he gave his books from his private library to the Art Academy, he gave some 4,000 books on art. When he gave his books to the Institute of Science library, he gave about 30 books on science. But it did become a scientific research library, just not from George Booth's collection. The most interesting aspect of the Saarinen building to me is this great concrete overhang. And it is one giant piece of cast concrete reinforced with steel, supported on cast concrete columns. And you see how it sort of has this very gentle drip to it. So this entire side is sort of cast intentionally down. I think, this is the only sort of exposed concrete element at Cranbrook in Saarinen's architecture. And so because it is so exposed and it has this sort of droop to it, I think Saarinen is trying to convey the weight of the concrete as it sort of drops down. So he's expressing this material, and then it's covered in this lovely vine. There are multiple Carl Milles sculptures here at the Institute, including these leaping boars. All of these were sculpted in the 1920s and then placed here as part of the conclusion of the 1938 construction. The only decorative element on the building are these cast stone columns. And they have this sort of right angle to them and then this half curve in. I think they're really quite beautiful, very simple in the design. It is identical on all four sides. It's certainly the most simple ornament that Saarinen ever deploys, but the Institute of Science is also Saarinen's most simplistic building that he ever designs for the campus. It has no sort of decorative brickwork, no other stone carving. It's very stripped down, very functional, very much on budget, but also I think reflecting this sort of scientific attitude, this sort of open facility for scientific study. Now, this is the addition that Eliel Saarinen and Henry Booth destroyed their friendship over because Eliel Saarinen wanted this to be one sort of open piazza all the way to the end of the brick wall. And he had a row of planted trees, sculpted trees, and then the brick wall on this side. You do see that there's the decorative paving in different shades of cast stone and limestone, and then there's decorative ceiling as well, like we see at Kingswood and the Art Museum. The original entrance to the museum would have gone in right here. And it does have the wonderful Cranbrook brick. And this brick was made in Ohio. The color that Saarinen would have called it was buckskin brick, but by this point, 1938, in the press it was reported as Cranbrook brick because it had become so associated with Saarinen's architecture here at Cranbrook. One interesting detail about these brick walls, they are still structural, but now instead of having a double brick masonry wall, it's brick and then hollow ceramic tile, which was another way of making this museum building a fireproof construction. You'll also see that the mortar lines are raked out on the horizontal and then flush on the vertical so that you get this great sort of horizontal linearity. Also, you'll notice these interesting color marks. This comes not from any sort of treatment on the bricks, but how they were fired. This is one brick sitting on top of the next brick in the kiln. And so what you're seeing is the different reactions for different heats. So here you see the way that two bricks were touching each other. And so that's the level of heat that's able to get in from the kiln between the two bricks. And so here, oh, that's quite fun. You can tell that the brick was sitting at the side. And so all of this was fired at a different heat than the central part of the brick. Now, right from the get-go, this was a much smaller building than what Saarinen initially proposed. He had proposed in 1934 a massive building that would have dominated this entire hillside. But it was thought that the Institute would never need that much space. It could never get that big. And so it opened and almost immediately is overrun with visitors. It is instantly the most crowded aspect of Cranbrook. It did not have any sort of easy way to get vehicular access onto the site. And so you see these pictures on summer days where the Institute just has these beautiful 1940s cars parked in every direction. Some days 4,000 guests a day were coming to the Institute. And so quite quickly, Dr. Robert Hatt, who was the formative early director of the Institute, Dr. Hatt was here from 1935 until 67. And with his wife, Marcel, until 1951, she died quite young, she was also a scientist. And so the Hatts were leading the Institute, and they began expanding it. And one of their first expansions was the McMath Planetarium, which I'm standing behind. It's a little bit hard to see it with all the ivy growing over it, but it is this beautiful 50-foot round section. And it was open in 1955. It was Michigan's first planetarium, and the architect was not Saarinen, but William Edward Kapp. And that name seems familiar, Kapp is an important Detroit architect. He was a designer with Smith, Hinchman, and Grills, the great Detroit firm, the oldest architecture firm in the country, operates as Smith Group today. And Kapp is most famous for his designs of Meadowbrook Hall, of the Rackham building at the University of Michigan, which is my favorite building at the University of Michigan. He also did the Players Club in Detroit, and he was a longtime trustee of the Institute of Science. And so we have this really sort of perfectly proportioned building. You can tell he even goes to the effort of designing the mortar and the brick to match the building. It really is a very nice addition. And he also designed addition on the far end of the building that simply extended Saarinen's language. He did not build the Reflections Cafe. Here we have a beautiful tribute to our founders, Cranbrook, fruit of their vision and generosity. And that is George and Ellen there in profile. This was sculpted in 1950 by Marshall Fredericks. And Fredericks came to Cranbrook in the early 30s as an assistant to Carl Millis, an instructor at Kingswood School for Girls. And he left in World War II to serve in the U.S. Army Air Force. He practiced in Detroit and in Birmingham, and he did this piece in 1950. And if you know the Cranbrook Founders Medal, this is the Founders Medal, is based off of this Fredericks design. There's one other sculpture I want to talk about here before I keep moving on to the next little portion of the Institute, and that is Sven Hedin, who was a Swedish geologist and explorer who wrote important books on Asia Minor. And he lived into the 1950s. He was a great inspiration and friend to the Millises. And so this is Mr. Hedin on a camel exploring Asia Minor, I assume, looking through his instrument to navigate across the landscape. I am sorry that I seem to be losing people. Yes, there is great concern over the ivy. We have various policies in place, but there is no sort of campus-wide opinion on the ivy. It is never good to let ivy grow in a building, but of course it is quite beautiful. Now, some of you may know Steggy. Steggy is a 1980 50th anniversary gift to the Institute of Science. So he was placed here in 1980 on the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Institute, not of the building. And just last fall, we had a great celebration on the restoration of Steggy. And I know that many of you were involved in donating to the fund to help restore Steggy. Now, I want to just step to the side briefly. Dr. Hatt was really involved in expanding the Institute. He expanded it with nature walks, with research initiatives. He himself did important research in Syria and Iraq. He expanded Cranbrook Institute of Science to northern Michigan. He had some over 60 publications in his time here. It was a real powerful force of science and scientific exploration in Michigan. And one thing he needed housing for visiting scientists. And so working with the Detroit Edison Electric Company in the last year of Dr. Hatt's tenure as head of the Institute, he dedicated the Edison Electric House. And so this was one of a number of examples where electrical companies would propose and build all-electric demonstration homes. So in the tradition of the case study houses in Los Angeles of the 40s and 50s, this house was paid for by the Edison Electric Company with support from different building trades. And it has a flat roof that would melt snow because it was electric snow melt. It had electric snow melt in the driveway, an electric oven, electric heater, electric toaster built into the kitchen table. It had electric window defoggers in the bathroom. It had electric, really electric everything. Interestingly, it still has a hearth because Dr. Hatt said, I don't care if it's electric heat, the hearth is the center of the home. And so he's sort of really leaning into this very 19th century idea of the fireplace, one that was promoted by Frank Lloyd Wright. And the Institute, the Edison House here, it is a guest house. It has a full family home upstairs and then an apartment down below with conference room as well. It's made out of redwood, treated redwood, and then on the inside it has some 14 different types of plywood to demonstrate all of the different trees that you can turn into plywood veneer. So it really was this showpiece. Right now it's unused, but hopefully will one day be restored. The architect was William P. Smith, who was an in-house architect for the Edison Electric Company. I could find absolutely nothing about Mr. Smith as an architect. I'm pretty sure he was designing electrical substations, and this is his one house. He was, in the 1920s, a contractor working out of Pontiac. So he would have been rather old by the time that he designed the Edison Electric House. It was dedicated in July of 1966 with Thomas Edison's children in attendance. So this gives us a good view of the Institute of Saarinen's era. And I want to now talk a little bit about the expansion. Before I get there, of course, I've neglected to mention the light tower. This is a George Booth proposal that he sketched out in a letter to Eliel Saarinen from a train as he was traveling across the West. And he proposed that the Institute have its own landmark in the same way the Art Museum would have its columns and Kingswood chimneys and the Boys' School, the tower. Saarinen proposed building, or George Booth proposed a great tower of light. And so it's glass block within a limestone base. Originally, the parking for the Institute was all done towards the light standard. Now we park away from it. And when you are driving up Woodward Avenue in the winter, you can see this thing. If you know what to look for in this sort of dark hill, you just see it out in the distance. And if we turn around and look down the hill, you can see Kingswood Lake. And so this was where the zoo was from 29 to 31, and it's where there are nature trails and different things to explore as part of the Institute, and then Kingswood School for Girls is right there alongside the lake. Now, when it came time to expand the Institute of Science, there was an earlier plan from the 1980s proposed by Goya Obata of HOK Architects of St. Louis, a graduate of Cranbrook. And Mr. Obata proposed removing the McMath Planetarium, building a new glass building here, and then building a huge sort of solid black box behind it. That building was never well received from the central administration, and it marked a real distinct shift of the Cranbrook institutions from being able to sort of expand on their own to Cranbrook expanding as a one community. And so we're looking at Stephen Holl's 1998 Institute edition, which was part of the 5 centennial projects outlined in the Cranbrook Vision by Lillian Bowder. And Stephen Holl proposed, if Saarinen's building is essentially a C, we're looking at one wing of the C here, the main part of the building goes back, and then the other part there. Stephen Holl proposed building a second C and slipping it. And so he slips his building, turns it into an O shape, and he uses Mankato Kasota limestone, the same stone that Kingswood is built out of in the art museum. Of course, now it is a veneer, but it's still the same stone. There's one solid piece of the stone, which is the bench here. And Stephen Holl, as an architect, is a very interesting character. He's certainly someone that I admire, even if he's I don't know why, controversial figure in the architecture world. He was born and raised in Washington. He went to the University of Washington and then studied at the Architectural Association in London and then in Rome. He opened his office in 1976 in New York. And he was neither a sort of modernist nor a postmodernist. He thought modernists did not sort of understand the beauty and poetry of architecture, and he thought the postmodernists were too light and silly. And so his plan is one that is really materially rich. This is acid-washed brass. So the acid is what has turned the door red, and then unacid-wash brass poles. And if you notice, they are both a C for Cranbrook, but it's also the model of the building. And so we are standing right here, walking into this tall room called the Light Laboratory, and then Stephen Holl's addition is outlined here. And so this is Saarinen's building sits here, Stephen Holl sits there, and you enter the building by opening his door. And then on the inside, you see that there is this C shape in this direction, which looks as if it has been sort of worn down by the ages of time. It's a sort of ruin. And then within the Light Laboratory, it is this great white volume. And you have 7 different types of glass, the sort of crinkle, you have rolled glass, and it's meant on a sunny day to project light into the lobby and create different sort of refractions and rainbows all around. And then the building itself goes into the Beresford lobby that is supported in part by Florence Beresford, one of the Booth's daughters, and her husband. And the lobby has this wonderful Pompeian plaster in red, and then custom light fixtures, stainless steel benches. Another tour will be able to get into the building and explore more of its interior design. I want to step out and look at the connection between Saarinen and Stephen Holl. You see that he just sort of jams the building up against it. Stephen Holl's very interested in sort of thinking of the building as a kit of parts, and in his early models, he does countless studies of sort of blocks and how the blocks could go down to this ravine, because the building is sited on this steep hill. And so eventually he settles on the C shape, And you'll notice that the C shape repeats on the entire building. So you see the same C shape from the handle is actually the outline of the building. Imagine that banner isn't there, and then see how he sort of uses the glass and steel frame as if it is a geode. It has this sort of geologic patterning. And I love that the Kasota stone is starting to get the same degradation that we see at Kingswood and at the Art Museum. And then as we turn the side, we see that his building transitions from the Mankato stone into custom cinder blocks, and he's again interested in the sort of intersections and connections of the building. You can see straight through. Saarinen never designs a thick building that's just an empty black box, and so Stephen Holl did not want to sort of break the scale of Saarinen's building. He wants to keep it skinny and sort of extend the same scale and language of Saarinen's design. This is called channel glass, and this is a structural system that allows light and shadow to pass, but it is fireproof and it's also quite strong. If you know much about the work of Stephen Holl, you might know the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, which is all made of channel glass and sort of looks like, I don't know, glaciers going down. Behind the Institute is another of Dr. Hatt's editions, 1968, a little annex to the Institute of Science. And then on the back of Stephen Holl's building, we see this rooftop access that we won't go up because it is alarmed and you are not allowed up there. And as we look into the building, you can see that you can see straight through it this way as well. So always this interest in how one sees through and around the building. As we watch it head down the hill, on one side it just looked like a one-story building with this sort of glassy entrance. On this side you'll see it is 2 stories with a one level sneaking down the hill. And these lines, which are so confusing because they're not parallel, they're not perfectly level. The museum itself isn't level, so it is a sort of spiraling ramp, and you're meant to wander through the galleries and up and over. And then he wanted the building to be lifted up like this so that the interior courtyard would spill out into the landscape. And so in his design, you would actually visit the museum, you would spiral around through the Saarinen, his building, Saarinen, his building, and you would end up in a rooftop gallery, and then you would exit down into the nature walks. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. But you can see that he does sort of bring the landscape down into the building. And the landscape architect of this project was a man named Peter Osler, who designed the Erb Family Science Garden here, a generous donation from the Erb family, which features natural Michigan plants, Michigan native species. And many of these native plants were actually gathered from the Cranbrook House and Gardens Wildlife Rescue, where they go and they take important examples of Michigan wildlife from construction sites and save them. The main sort of teaching tool of this garden are the 3 phases of water. I'm in the House of the Vapor. It's all turned off. This was a gallery of water within the museum, and then this is where vapor is examined, so water as a gas. And then as you turn the corner within the garden, you'll see how Stephen Holl connects his building as a giant trussed bridge. And we look forward towards the House of Ice. And so this is a structure designed by the architecture students at Cranbrook Academy of Art under the direction of Dan Hoffman. And it had hoses that went up to the top and then would spray mist water down over the stainless steel ribs, and it would turn into this sort of glacial cube. My understanding is it never really worked, and the one photo we have that shows it is they actually had to take hoses and hose the thing down, and then it froze. So, best laid plans. Now, Stephen Holl, just like Eliel Saarinen, he thinks of design and of architecture as a whole art. So it's not only the building that he designed, but he also designed the exhibits, the light fixtures. He designed the signage, the furniture, the benches, the door handles. It's a very Cranbrook way of working. And I want to head up towards the high point of the garden so that we can look back at the building. It's fun as you sort of emerge uphill, the way that Stephen Holl and Eliel Saarinen's buildings interact, with Eliel Saarinen's great chimney stack coming down there, and then Stephen Holl's building working across. Now we get to water as a liquid here, so we had the house of the vapor, the house of ice, and then you have the water here. The garden is not open to visit, so none of you saw how I got here, and you won't follow my footsteps. As we look, I had to come in here, though, to show us the back of the Institute of Science building. This is the 1938 Eliel Saarinen building, and when it opens in 38, it really was a sort of all-inclusive facility of scientific study. So within this 45,000 square foot building, there were exhibits, there was an auditorium, there were workshops, there was a store, there was a boiler room, there was an apartment, there was the library, and then there was extensive laboratory and research space. And so from the other side, where it looked like a 3-story building, now you understand that it is 6 stories. Yes, so the garden is part of the museum, so the garden is closed because the museum is closed. But on a normal day, you're welcome to come and explore. What I think is wonderful about Saarinen's design is that this is 1938, which makes the Institute of Science a year older than the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is, of course, the most famous flat-roofed Spartan glass block museum. And I do think that you see the influence of Eero Saarinen back from his architectural studies. You see sort of the new modernism that is evolving away from Saarinen's more historically inspired, more tactile modernism that you see at Kingswood. And the public sphere is all on this middle level where there are no windows. These were the offices, and then this was originally supposed to be just a storeroom, but it opened as a boardroom and then cafeteria. And the reason it was there was because Saarinen did not like that the freight elevator override was going to interrupt his flat roof. And so he proposed putting a full level. When the Institute of Science directors saw that, they said, well, we don't want to put the rooftop penthouse as storage, make it a conference room. And then they went to George Booth and said, well, if it's a conference room, some of our board members are elderly. They'll need the elevator to get higher. George Booth saw through their ploy for more square footage and said, no, the elevator stops here. And so you do have to walk up to what is now storage. And then we see on this side Stephen Holl's wing, which has more of the channel glass, and you see the way that the exhibit halls end with you running the ramp up to the rooftop exhibits. And the rooftop exhibit space is not open to the public because the railing is too low. So I don't know if anyone has any other questions. The Institute is, of course, a great resource for Michigan students and sort of endless opportunities here once it reopens. Sadly, we won't be having summer camp this year, but hopefully soon you'll be able to come back and visit. We've had membership since 1937, and you can become a member, and I do believe that when it reopens, it will reopen to members first. I want to pause here and look at another one of Stephen Holl's funny little light fixtures. And there is one more wing to the museum, the west entrance. That opened in 2005 to designs of Dan Hoffman. And we won't make our way all the way back around just to see it. But it is a pretty sprawling campus. And I hope that you have enjoyed this tour of the exterior, seen some and learned some new things. This is the building of Eliel Saarinen's that has been most altered and certainly most sort of functionalist of his aesthetic. And so I do think it's interesting to study it and see how buildings grow and adapt, because they always outlive their architect. And I think this one really shows the way that function and design don't always last forever. I do think Stephen Holl was really able to straighten out a lot of Saarinen's sort of what became mistakes over time, like the dead ends of his C-shaped museum. So thank you so much for joining. I'll see you next Wednesday for another tour. I'm not sure where we'll be yet, but I'll be here live at 5. I'm your curator, Kevin Adkisson. I'll be on Instagram again Tuesday and Thursdays at 5. Wednesday, Facebook live at 5. I will see you all tomorrow, or next Wednesday.